But before we get there, I just want to make one announcement. There's been some changes within the Western Cape SAPI committee, and I want to introduce you to the members. So, as chairman, we have Rainer Moodley from academia, and he tendered his apology for today, but he is the chair. The vice chair is myself, Nathaniel Jacobs, and I'm from Western Cape Government. And we have the secretariat, which is Kalipra, and she's from the private sector. And then we also have other members from the private sector that's also part of the committee, which is Mark Job, Elza Denshelwood, Quinita Sami, and then we also have Eliana Jacobs from the Western Cape government, and then we also have Laurel Robertson, who is from local government, namely the city of Cape Town. So before I hand over to the chair, which is Ashraf Adams, I just want to give a brief introduction to the chair and to the panel. So Ashraf Adams, I'll start with you. Ashraf has 28 years experience as a policy advisor, senior manager, and thought leader across various spheres of business and government. Before joining the Mandela Bay Development Agency, Ashraf was the executive director for economic development at Salga, from where he was seconded for 7 months to the Mandela Bay Development Agency as acting chief executive officer. Apart from urban renewal, the Mandela Bay Development Agency is also responsible for the management of the Nelson Mandela Bay Stadium and the Utenay Resource Center. Ashraf has obtained his bachelor's degree in history and political science from the University of Durban. He then went on to obtain his master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Natal. Since then, Ashraf has attended and contributed to various conferences and seminars across the globe, including the World Urban Forum in Medellin, Municipal Climate Partnership in Senegal, as well as Cities Alliance Summit in London, amongst others. Here we're moving on to Cathy Stone. She is a built environment governance specialist and professional urban and regional planner. She is focused on the integration of developing planning for the public finance and sector planning towards more interdisciplinary, practical, and implementable plans that achieve the spatial transformation of South African cities. Catherine has 20 years of professional experience, most of which are in local government. Presently the Director of Spatial Planning for the Western Cape Provincial Government. Catherine previously held the position of Director for Spatial Planning and Urban Design at the City of Cape Town and has worked in the NGO sector. She has also various built environment development related national guidelines and served as a board member of the Development Action Group and technical advisor to the Land Value Capture Program. And I'm moving on to Dean Van Zyl. He is the chairman of the Western Cape Property Development Forum since 2011. Dean holds degrees in architecture and a master's degree in urban design. His interest lies in development facilitation through a multidisciplinary approach with specific emphasis on land beneficiation, precinct development, and brownfields land remediation and development. He is a director at Alvin Labsher and Associates and the sole proprietor of Q Group Development Facilitation and specializes in land sourcing, development, conceptualization, and land beneficiation. And then lastly, we have Pate Ahmad. He's he's a Metropolitan Spatial Planning Manager at the City of Cape Town and also the host of the Talking Transformation podcast. Peter has served in public service for the past 21 years. He has undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in town and country planning from the University of Manchester in the UK. He presently manages the City Growth Management Unit at the City of Cape Town Metropolitan Municipality. He is responsible for the metropolitan planning issues in the city. The team he leads is charged with the compilation of key planning policy and strategy documents, including the Municipal Spatial Development Framework and the Built Environment Performance Plan. So that is the introduction to the chair and to the panel. Just some house rules for today's session before I give over to Ashraf. Can we all please mute our microphones? And there will be a session for questions. So if you would like to pose a question, if you can please just raise your hand. You are also welcome to use the chat box facility on Teams if you'd like to make any comments throughout the session. So on that note, Ashraf, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathaniel. And I deliberately keep my CV not updated, so it doesn't say 32 years. It just says 28 years of experience. Colleagues, thank you very much. This is really it's an honor for me. I haven't facilitated a session like this in a really long time, and so I'm very happy to have been asked. From your side, if you do wish to have questions and you don't want to ask them personally, use the chat box. And if there are several questions of a similar theme, then we will have theme-based questions. If there's one specific question that captures everything, we will then use that question. So we'll be flexible around that. So feel free to do that. What I would like to discourage is a conversation in the chat box, in the question and answer, because I think it distracts from what the speakers are saying and the conversation itself. So if I could ask you not to have a set of private conversations in the chat box, but feel free to ask. And I think with enough time, we have enough time, and I think as a result of that, we should be able to have open discussions. And in terms of open discussions, I don't mind people coming in without, if you just need to respond to something, or somebody's has responded to your question, but you just feel you need to follow up and you just need to come in there without being aggressive or rude, that's also fine with me. So if we can just go along that way. If you do want to ask a question, Nathaniel is going to check who you are, and then he will let you come in at that particular point in time. So having said that, let's start off with Cathy. Thank you very much.
Sorry, did I hear correctly? You're starting with me.
I thought that was the order. Is it Pete? The email I got was, but Pete, I'm happy for you to start.
You've robbed me of the last word, Ashraf. I was told it was Pete, Dion, and then I'm me.
Well, then that's exactly how we're going to go. Pete, Dion, and Cathy. So Pete, and then Dion, and then Cathy. Right.
I just want to check that, we did have an agreement that Dion would lead. I'm more than happy. I'm ready to go. But Dion, just to check with you, sir.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I must apologize. I should have checked that out, because the email I got was something else. Dion, do you want to go first?
Ashraf, I think it's my privilege to throw the stone in the pond, and I think that's why I've been invited to come along.
Please go ahead.
All right. First of all, Ashraf, last time we saw each other was at conference, and let me do the PR quickly before I get into the rest of my suggestions. Conversation is incredibly important, and I think for the Western Cape Property Development Forum, that's exactly what it's about. People refer to us as the Western Cape Property Developers Forum. We are not. We are the Western Cape Property Development Forum, which includes infrastructure and top structure. We have got three main groupings in our membership. We've got developers. We've got a very broad base of consultants. Many of the people in the room are also members in their private capacity or through their firms. And then lastly, we have got contractors, civil and building contractors. So we are about the production line of property and everything that goes into that. And I think everybody would agree that property development, whether you're building for the public sector or for the private sector, is an incredibly complex process. I like to refer to the industry as a proverbial pizza with many, many small slices. And unless all of those slices are in place, unless the topping is on all slices and they're all tasty, there is no development. And from experience, the industry is incredibly frustrated about the fact that single slices, single spokes of a wheel, single slices of this proverbial pizza has got the ability to veto projects. And that is the context in which I've approached the theme. What is the private sector's view on the combination or the suite of statutory layers, this proverbial club sandwich that the public sector presents to civil society and general society out there as their management structure? It starts with the IDP, which in theory is representative of the SDFs, and of course all of this speaks to the budget, and then Cathy is probably the best place to talk about the BEPS and all of the rest of this. But what does it practically mean to the industry? We understand the need for planning. If anywhere there is a sector that deals with strategy and budgets, it is my sector. It is the private sector development industry. And it would be totally arrogant of us to voice an opinion about the lack of a need for planning. So I just want to make that as an upfront statement. There is a critical need for planning, and there is a critical need for strategy. But if you plan for plan's sake, and if you strategize for strategize's sake, and if you budget in a way that you will never spend your budget, then by default, all of those incredibly strategic layers in this club sandwich become irrelevant. Right, so where are we today? And please forgive me, I know the City of Cape Town's budget reasonably well, so a lot of the anecdotal stories will refer to Cape Town. It's not a let's get Cape Town, it is a reflection from a practical point of view, and let's also remind ourselves that 75% of the Western Cape economy in fact sits in Cape Town. The same is true for Stellenbosch, to a lesser extent for Drakenstein and so forth, and we can talk about some of the smaller municipalities as well. The question that I ask myself is not so much about the need for those layers. The question is, how serious are they taken, and what is the practical implication for the industry? Now, Cape Town's SDF, and if I just take my career, Cathy and I were at varsity together, so Cathy's a bit younger than I am, so let's give her that credit. You know, in our career from late 90s onwards, we have seen a number of these layers come and go. And these layers, unfortunately, and it's a constitutional reality, are attached to the 5-year cycles, and very often they're attached to political brands, and they are attached to political custodians. When executive teams, political teams change in local authorities, unfortunately, the rule of thumb is the IDP, the SDF, and the budget goes out of the window, and everybody tries and reinvents the wheel. So these strategic documents that should in fact be setting a 20 to a 30-year strategy are not taken seriously purely because the Constitution does not require them to be taken seriously. It's a very harsh statement that I'm making, but if forward planning was a multi-generational activity, and if there were a way of distilling vision down to its core principles, and all of these planning layers were not hundreds of pages of documents, but they could actually be summarized on the back of a cigarette box. And if they were stuck to consistently for at least a decade, preferably 2 or 3 decades at a time, then by default, they would have to be taken seriously. But the reality is, it's a watch and wait game from the private sector to firstly see what is in these documents, and secondly, whether the particular local government or provincial structure, if they're at a higher tier, actually takes those documents seriously itself. Okay, so how do we know as the private sector whether those documents are taken seriously by the various spheres of government? Well, the first thing we look at is the budget. We look at what the budget prioritizes, and then we look at the performance of the budget. Now, when your budget starts to reflect 38, but in reality closer to 42% of revenue being allocated to red tape and bureaucracy, i.e. staff, then by default, the cynic in me starts to say an organization that exists for its own existence sake. Or as we used to joke in Cape Town, a city that works for those it employs. Okay, so then we start to look at the capex. And I've got to give major credit to our new, very young mayor in Cape Town. In my career, the first mayor that stood on a public stage and publicly apologized for the under-expenditure of the capital budget. It was a first. So why have we seen going on close to a decade of capital budgets being underspent and it being tolerated? So again, you've got to forgive me. The cynic in me asks the question, did the political custodians at that stage and the senior, and I'm not having a go at the junior staff, the senior staff of that particular municipality give any credence to the budget? Because on my side of the fence, in the private sector, if you do not hit your budgets, it is very close, if not a firing offence. So we've developed a culture of adjustment budgets in which we shift money around, and then more often than not, we praise our performance in terms of the adjustment budgets. Now, come on, guys. So we set the target low, we underperform the target, and then we drop the target and we think we've done well. So then I've been spending time looking at various municipalities trying to extract the KPIs of city managers and executive directors. And the reality is, I do not find the language in terms of performance that actually allows me to measure true performance. So that's having a go at the budget. But now let's step back. The budget supposedly reflects the IDP. But if we are not serious about the budget, why would we be serious about an IDP? And if we then start to talk about spatial planning, if one year there can be an urban edge and the next year an urban edge is not relevant, and then the next year maybe there is a bit of an urban edge, but nobody actually knows whether the SDF has led to two very simple things. And to be brutally honest, those are the only two things that are relevant out there. And that is, have we facilitated service delivery? In fact, three things. Have we created economic activity? And the spin-off of economic activity, how many jobs have we actually facilitated through these layers, or the layers in the club sandwich? Now, I cannot find that data in the IDP or in the IDP review. I cannot find it in the SDF or in the SDF review, and I specifically could not find it in the midterm or the adjustment budget, at least in the case of Cape Town, when I looked through it. Now, that then brings into question, what is the purpose of local government? And again, I would like to remind the audience, I'm not questioning whether there is a need for strategic planning. I'm saying we are planning for planning's sake and not for delivery. So let's ask the question, what is the purpose of local government? And you've got to forgive me, I think in simple concepts. Having consulted quite widely within the industry and having consulted quite widely with other professional associations, there is a central theme which I simplified to the following. The core purpose of local government is the provision of utility services. That is why municipality came into being in the first place, to keep the water channels clean in Rome, to keep the corpses out of the streets, and to make sure that the roads were kept wide enough for to prevent fires jumping between buildings. You find the same story in the history of London and any of the great cities of the world. Purpose of local government is primarily, and I would argue 70% of its energy should go into the planning and the provision of utility services. But the reality is, if you start reading the budgets and everything else and the planning jargon that goes into SDFs and IDPs, we think the purpose of local government is a social service institution. It is not. Social services is one of the second purposes of local authority, but it is a substantially smaller role than utility service. And the third world or purpose of local government is growth. Why am I saying growth? Because quite simply, urbanization is a reality. You need to run a local government. You need a budget. You can either tax the citizens out of all glory, or you can broaden the tax base. Right. We have followed the first. If you go and track the taxation increases in local government in the Western Cape, we are taxing our citizens out of all proportion. If you go and look at the broadening of the tax base, we have not spent any time on it. So what is the end line of the story? Well, at some stage, people start to vote with their feet. If it's too expensive to be in a specific local authority, you up and you out. The classic example is the conversation that took place between Texas and Elon Musk, right? Now, in the States, and yes, it's a federal system, and yes, states and local governments have substantially more tools to work with. But business investors vote with their feet. The general population follow the employment process. So if we are not going to make growth a very, very important conversation, and not the theory of growth, not the academic planning of growth, but the reality, the conversation with chambers of commerce, etc., and organizations like the Western Cape Property Development Forum, if we are not going to have an honest and brutal conversation about growth, then we're in trouble. Now, on that topic, let me just make another point. The Western Cape Property Development Forum does not just represent lily white, middle-aged and older white males, right? If you look at our ManCom, if you look at our membership list, I'm proud to say that we are probably the most representative when it comes to civil society at the moment. And very soon, the Township Development Forum will also join the Western Cape Property Development Forum as an associate member. The messages I'm getting out of the townships are exactly the same messages I'm getting out of listed companies. Too much red tape, the officials don't know what they want, and actually, they all interpret their own policy documents as they see fit, i.e. every slice of the pizza is a super speciality and what I've come to call academic activism or professional activism per slice. And whether you're a township developer or whether you're a listed company, SDF does not give you a clear direction. The budget does not guarantee you services capacity. The IDP does not mean that anybody is mandated to assist you in rolling away the rocks that are in front of you. So guys, the core message from my side is not get rid of the IDP, the SDF, or the budget. The core message is, are we actually serious about those documents, and do those documents become our executive authority on which we live and die by? And whether you're in a political role or whether you're in a senior administration role, it's the same question. And I think the conversation that is being facilitated today mustn't waste time, please, on whether we need those documents. You cannot run a business or a government without planning. What we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we turn those things into practical documents so that if a developer, whether he's in the township or whether he's doing the Century City, gets absolute clarity so that he or she can make a very quick decision to pack his or her bags and go elsewhere, or to open up the door and to invest. Because remember, some things in those documents will not speak to every potential investor. And that's okay. We don't need to be everything for everybody. But what we owe the investment industry, and again, through the full spectrum, is clarity on what we want. And what we want needs to be deliverable, and it needs to be testable in terms of capital investment from both public and private sector, performance in terms of budget, and at the end of the day, at a 49% unemployment rate, have we created jobs? And if we are not going to use these three layers, and there are other layers as well in the statutory framework, if those are not going to be focusing on those key deliverables, then, good friends, there will be nothing left. And I keep on saying to colleagues out there, I've lived in Brazil for a year. Table Mountain is going to make a wonderful informal settlement scaffold, right? If we don't deal with the practicalities, if we don't start building infrastructure and linking communities and haves and have-nots and activating economies, society will tell us with their stomachs what is required. So I think for the planning profession, and there's been a very interesting opinion piece that was written by one of your colleagues up in Gauteng, and I know some of you have read it. I know there's quite a bit of gnashing of teeth and rolling of eyes about what is the purpose of planning, and has the planners lost the plot. I think there is a place for planning, but what we need now is a conversation where the private sector, both the formal and the informal, the public sector and academia plot the future of planning as a profession. Because whether you like it or not, you are the biggest input into the SDF IDP process. Yes, there is some filtering that takes place by the bean counters when it comes to the budget, but the planning profession needs to now take this conversation forward. So Ashraf, I hope I've thrown a rock into the pond. And yeah, let's see where this conversation goes.
By my standards, very mild. By my standards, that's very mild, Dion. No, but thank you very much. I think you've raised some really important points. The 5 points that you've raised, I'm not going to repeat them, but I think you've concluded by saying, so how do we make the IDP, the SDP, the budget, those kind of practical documents that lead us somewhere? And how can we bring in the new partners to make that happen? So I think there's something to ponder over, and we can take that further in the discussion. Thank you. Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Ashraf. Again, good afternoon, colleagues. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and a huge respect to SAPI Western Cape. I see there's over 100 people on the call at the moment, and that's to be really welcomed and applauded. Thank you. Colleagues, with your permission, I'm going to share my screen for a moment and just take you through some reflections from my side. Not reflecting as the city of Cape Town, but really around a experience of local government and provincial government over 26 years, and trying to understand what's made sense and what hasn't. So please, this is not a City of Cape Town presentation, it's my reflections, using both Joburg material, Cape Town material, and some new stuff. But really, from the outset, I mean, I think this is sort of going to what Dion's saying. There are so many different levels of plans. Some are new, some are not, some are effective, some have been effective and are no longer effective. And really, it's about trying to make sense of all of this jargon and requirements and saying, what are we actually trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And that's why this next slide really is just trying to unpack the ambition. I'm not going into the legal fine print. I think anybody who wants to read what the requirements for MSDF and IDP and how they need to be done together in terms of Systems Act, you're welcome to read the red tape and the fine print. I'm just saying that if you look at these things in terms of a framing device, the long term, typically 4 or 5 political terms or IDP cycles is around the MSDF. And often what we've seen over the last 2 decades and more has been these grand plans of 2030, 2040, 2050, which often come with a huge amount of trumpeting and championing, and then ultimately get thrown to the wayside somewhere down the next political term of office. Might be done by province, it might be done by the cities, but they've all got them, and they've all had them, and they've all discarded them at some stage. The MSDF, and we'll talk about some of my experiences on that, both in Joburg and in Cape Town, it has to have a long-term impact. It has to have a long-term view. It cannot be looking at the immediate sort of 6 months. It does, however, need to take cognizance of the context of the municipality. The political term, clearly the IDP, each of the municipalities at the moment really trying to play catch-up right now in respect of the delayed elections last year. So very curtailed, truncated processes to try and get us to an IDP approval in May. Certainly that's the case here in Cape Town. No doubt it's happening across the country. And then on the MTREF, typically that 3-year budget cycle, and on an annual basis, the budget. Those are the products that really I understand as being very sequential and logical framework for us to understand the plans. And that's a classic planner's slide, right? It's logic, it's coherent, it makes sense. No one's going to argue with that. Well, what are we trying to do with that? We're trying to at least give the clarity, the certainty that Dion and the private sector are looking at, trying to have a degree of efficiency within the system, trying to get the sequencing right. So making sure that we're not building sewage plants, for example, but we don't have the power to actually turn them on. So the sequencing of our infrastructure is one thing. But it becomes complicated very quickly when, for example, certain pieces of that puzzle and sequencing are beyond a different sphere of government, that it's not within the municipal space. Classic example within Cape Town, of course, would be the rail as one example. Not within our realm of mandate, but absolutely dependent on the efficiency, both economically and spatially, and the mobility of our citizens. And we know we're beholden unto a national environment which has been wholly unsympathetic and wholly ineffective in actually changing that. So alignment is really important. We're going to talk a bit more about that just now. Just coming back to the point, this is not about the private sector alone. I've always understood and always worked on the basis that we're talking about a series of plans that can unpack and give guidance to both the public and the private sector in terms of saying, this is the plan, we get behind the plan, and we execute accordingly. And it's supposed to impact on the lives and the prosperity of communities, of businesses, and people who are looking in from the outside saying, is, for argument's sake, Johannesburg, Mangaung, Cape Town a good place to invest based on their planning rationale and thinking? So if you were looking for a hashtag, I'm saying this suite of plans really is trying to get to a situation where you say, what is it you stand for? What is it that you are in business to support and encourage the community and business environment of a municipality? And it should be simples, right? It should be easy stuff. But of course, our experience is very much this picture of an incredible web of complexity. And what do I mean by complexity, and why do I say there's a degree of complexity within that? Well, I think at the very least, we can look at these elements. The legislation itself, I think we're over and over lauded as South Africa for having the best legal framework and policy frameworks in the world. However, our execution and our actual ability to show results leaves a lot to be desired. The guidelines, we were talking just before we came onto the call with Ashraf, Cathy, and others saying, you know, the BEP, which we'll talk about just now, the Built Environment Performance Plan, was probably one of the best examples of trying to articulate the degree of resourcing of the spatial planning of cities, certainly the metros that we've seen. But the guidelines themselves grew into almost 100+ pages of requirements. How are you supposed to have what Dion referred to as a sort of on the back of a cigarette packet messaging when you've got 100 pages of compliance-related issues? You've also got multiple interests, multiple personalities, multiple champions, who at times will drive in a very effective way a particular message, a very particular agenda. And we've seen it with the whole one plan, or was it district planning exercise at national, who've come on the scene after the BEP. And as a practitioner, I just shrug my shoulders and say, well, here we go again, another roundabout. And you know, that to me is a huge issue. The content itself of what we deal with in those plans is complicated. It should be data driven, but it needs to be responsive to the needs on the ground. And that in itself often provides shortcomings in terms of our ability. And then, of course, the context. Again, we'll talk a bit about that. This is a slide that we put together during the BEP period, and it tries to strip away layers of what this whole alignment game, the cooperation, and this idea of co-planning. And I think it's one thing to say, yeah, no, we're all aligned, and I can show you every document. No document is going to say it's working in the absence, or no department, no city, no department is going to say we're working in the absence of a plan. They all have their plans. Is it the same plan? Often it's not. Let's be clear on that. It's driven by different agendas at different parts of the country. And between the national, provincial, and metro space, really what we've been trying to drive towards over the years and decades since 1994 has been to have coherence in the planning and the programs, to have aligned financial arrangements and aligned institutional arrangements to make the difference. Now that, again, classic planning slide there, nice colors, nice PowerPoint, done it all. Yeah, hopefully there's no typos in there. But if you try to strip it away and say, what's under that? You see, this is the complex planning and programs aspects, the financial and the institutional and functional arrangements. I haven't even begun to update this. This was probably done about 2 or 3 years ago. But the framework will hold. And you start to see that within each of those boxes, there are people, there are processes, there are milestones, there are demands that are being made. And in terms of the long-term plans, typically, what we have seen and worked within the national space, the NDP, the National Spatial Development Framework. Colleagues, how many years is it? We still don't have a National Spatial Development Framework that's approved. We've got a draft. Go, please, somebody to Google it for me while I'm talking. Don't find me the approved NSDF. You won't find it. The PSDF, the team there, DEDP, Marek and Corbus, Cathy and the team doing great work. But the PSDF, going to need to relook at that, I would suggest, on the back of this new sort of new terms of office, rethink some of the things. And then, of course, the municipal space, the IDP, the Municipal Spatial Development Framework, etc., providing that. Those are the long-term plans, and immediately what it suggests is multiple political terms of office. It implies a plan that is beholden unto the agenda of and the thinking of the latest incumbent. And we've seen in Cape Town in recent times, even within the same party, fundamental changes within the personalities and champions and the agendas that have been driven. So let's not kid ourselves that this slide here is an easy one to unpack or to engage and operate within. I think this is, again, picking up, and I think often Dion and I sometimes might be seen in this sort of adversarial way, but we are often batting from the same degree of understanding. And I'm saying that we are very clear that the city's ability and municipalities' ability to lead, to cajole, to facilitate is based on a handful of things it can do and must do well. Infrastructure provision, land availability and management, the management of that space, the urban management techniques, which I would argue we've been woeful, even in spite of things like the CIDs, special rating areas and so forth. We still don't have a technique of that for example, informal settlements that actually is any meaningful approach. The development approvals, how fast we are, how responsive to support land use change and building that ultimately changes the nature of our built environment and particularly the lives of our communities. The financial plan, the financial sustainability, long-term financial plan. That's still, again, please, somebody, welcome Google. Long-term financial plan for, let's pick one, Tshwane. Go and find me that, please. I'd love to see it. I'm not sure it exists. You can also look for Cape Town whilst you're at. Engaged and active citizenry. That's a really important thing of saying it can't just be that the city provides. There needs to be a degree of payback and a degree of responsiveness of the citizens it serves, both the haves and the have-nots. And then, of course, this responsiveness to context that I've mentioned in a slide or two earlier. I'm just going to give this as, I mean, anybody who's seen a presentation of mine will have seen this slide, prepared by my colleague Jaco Petzer here at the City of Cape Town. You can, whether we were presenting in Mangaung, whether we were presenting in eThekwini today, Nelson Mandela, each of those municipalities would have their own statistical contextual situation. They would also have their spatial disaggregation, the fragmentation that you see on the right-hand side around where people live and where people work, and how that starts to frame itself. And I think, depending on which, the whole statistical analysis that we often do very, very well, but we know that certain of these things are going to change. Our unemployment rates, I think 30% here in Cape Town, record highs. The household compositions, they are reducing in size, meaning actually increasing the demands around the housing supply. So those numbers will change, but I suspect even with the best efforts of everybody who's worked towards spatial transformation in the Cape Town, those images on the on the right-hand side here, those will not change overnight. They will not change within the next decade unless we're committed to the plan. I took a drive back into my my archive, and I was looking at this work back in the day. I think it was 2005 within Johannesburg. Some of these things we've talked about, where we want to be, what are our key priorities, how do we get there? This was the approach that was taken in the IDP back in the day in Joburg. You see there the 2030 vision. It was absolutely instructive on the left-hand side of being trumpeted at that stage. I think within 2 or 3 years, when 2030 would completely fallen off anybody's radar, anybody's interest. And those mayoral issues, I can tell you, in Joburg for many years, CBD was the single priority from a spatial point of view. Getting that right, working on getting Alexandra upgraded through the Alexandra Urban Renewal in partnership with Province and National, and then the Soweto Roads program. For many years, those were the three or four things that ask anybody in the city, they would tell you exactly what was needed and what was being done. So that was, a time and a place in Joburg. Cape Town, I wasn't here in 2007. I'm not even sure Cathy at that stage was working in 2007 on this particular element. And nevertheless, here was their inputs around the ideal of trying to steer 5-year capital budgets in a very strongly spatial aligned way. You see some of the slides here looking at the development strategy, talking about limited expansion of footprint, reinforcement of the economic backbone, etc., etc. Many of these things carry through into the 2018 version, and even will carry through into the 2022 version when it's submitted for public participation as well as the approval. On the right-hand side here, what a surprise. The infrastructure issues that were a challenge then, many of those remain a challenge, which for somebody who's been batting strongly in the 8 years I've been here to get a much stronger alignment between the infrastructure rationale and investment and the areas of backlog and the challenge, it's a huge frustration that we have not been able to deal with that, particularly where it is so strongly aligned to our urban inner core messaging and the challenges that come with that. And then here are some of the questions at that stage. What should growth management strategy be? How should public investment be directed? This comes almost 5-6 years before the whole bet really started to get traction. Before spatial targeting, integration zones and so forth became the new language that we would speak. And ultimately through the 2012 CT SDF that Cathy and others worked on and got approved. I think it was the first spatial framework that was approved in the 12 years that it had taken to get to that point. I speak under correction. Let's fast forward to 2020 and try and fast forward my timing as well. This is the slide that we used in 2020, where we had at the apex of this planning framework, the idea that we'd be working towards IDP May 2022. That's on the cards, it's coming. But it was going to be informed by a whole range of things from a spatial planning side, not least of which the land use trends reports that articulated the changing dynamics, the assumptions and principles that we'd embedded, the district planning review that have been ongoing for 2 years, if not 3, the sector plans that looked at all the different engineering, master planning and so forth, the land use model, as I say, the residential, non-residential projections, and ultimately this idea of capital investment framework, and then this project pipeline of intergovernmental projects, the city plus province plus national plus the SOEs. I've highlighted that deliberately in red because that's what we were trying to drive towards. And I can tell you now, again, having chased that holy grail for at least 8 years here in Cape Town, we are a million miles away from it. Notwithstanding the cooperation we have from province, notwithstanding the many meetings we have with the national departments, we are a million miles away from it. You cannot have an effective IDP, colleagues, and actually believe, to use a quote from earlier today, it's worth the paper it's written on, unless you've got this broader framework in place. So, I mean, those are just some reflections on how those different images have changed, or similar themes that have carried through over the years. We know there are perennial challenges that the cities across the country face around, particularly in the housing space, land tenure, top structure densities, and how you support that in terms of infrastructure, amenities, your utilities, your transport networks, and then your social amenities, which are probably the hidden crisis within all of this. We can easily point towards the Potsdams and the Zandvliet here in Cape Town, but it's really the schools and the clinics where there are major challenges as well, in spite of all the effort. And I think we know that the forecast for some of these things is not good. Population will continue to increase, the congestion's likely to continue going up, revenue probably will continue to decrease, etc., etc. These are not firm figures, colleagues. Don't be looking at what they're trying to say. I'm saying these are the assumptions that we're making in thinking about how we deal with funding that infrastructure and amenity and making sure that we've got an effective city going forward. So MSDF, these are some slides that I've used. Again, apologies to those of you who've seen my slides before, but I do think these are important because this gets down to the crux of what we were trying to measure and understand. Now, the MSDF approach really needs to direct the where and what the city prioritizes, the CapEx and OpEx. Now, I'm telling you now that that's not the type of message that a politician wants to hear, nor a colleague from our finance department or the utilities. They want to know their business as usual. And it should have a fundamental impact on decision making around the budgets, an integrated approach. And I'm just using these, we'll come back to these figures just now, but over a 5-year tranche, there was 27 billion spent in this period between 12 and 2016. Most of you know this slide. This is the back of the cigarette packet, but just done on a T-shirt, front and back print. As opposed to a tour of your favorite rock band, it was simply saying, We have distilled down a very complex investment rationale with rules of the game, etc., to say we want to enhance green, avoid the grey, fix and maintain orange, and future-proof and upscale blue. It's as simple as that. That's the elevator pitch. Anybody of the team in planning should be able to tell you this. If they can't, they're in the wrong industry. It is, however, complex. The implementation dependencies are problematic because of the reliance on constant support from different political administrations. Just moving forward quickly, the famous slide that we used was to say we went back to this 27 billion. Sorry, I can't even count properly here, colleagues. 32 billion. I said in the euros at the time, you could have bought 18 Ronaldos. I think most people know Ronaldo is a football player there in Europe, and whether you love him or hate him, he has impact. I wanted to try and change up the narrative around how do we understand impact around infrastructure and investment. And the question I was asking is how many Ronaldos do we actually need to fix, maintain, and future-proof a city? Because ultimately, this guy has impact. Wherever he goes, he gets results. And I was trying to say, I'm not sure with all the Ronaldos we've spent so far, we've had the impact that we're looking for. And I'm not sure we actually understand how many of these guys do we need to actually fix what we've got. So those are just I was never asked to make a presentation again in the executive space on the back of this presentation, but it's still the one I think of, tried to change the narrative around impact and spend to try and get us moving forward. The BEP certainly assisted in making sense of the Ronaldos, how many, and what impact it was having. It certainly went the furthest to describe the intent, the strategy and approach in relation to the people and the systems, the land requirements, and the finance. And particularly with 4 lenses, the integration zones, the informal settlements, marginalized areas, and economic areas. I think the BEP really served the purpose that, and those involved at national, the drive from the City Support Programme, National Treasury of all the units in national to take up the mantra of spatial transformation. It's an indictment actually on the others, where the responsibility truly lay, that it took the finance guys to say, actually, we need to spend this money wisely. So these were some of the things that came with that. You'd see, if you've dealt with the BEP, this type of understanding of the budgets, and us explaining, this is where we're spending our money. This is where we are trying to understand where the money is going over a medium-term period. Apologies, colleagues. And but the real question was actually, what should it look like? Forget about what the budget is saying. How effective has the planning process been in shaping that pie chart to what it needs to actually support the T-shirt message, which was to upscale in blue, to maintain orange, and whatever you need to do in the green areas in terms of expanding and maintaining, that's all good. So I think these are some of the challenges and the real sense of, at times, embarrassment that I've had in recent months, particularly in relation to the failing infrastructure within the urban inner core, which is really, really a massive challenge in terms of credibility of the message going forward. Here's where I think the cities need to get to, the idea of public investment supporting the footprint, the existing footprint, and upscaling opportunities within whatever has been targeted within the municipal plans. Updating those master plans, getting to a list of infrastructure and buying it, getting the supply chain geared, getting it in a way that it's sequenced, making sure that there's a whole issue of public and private sector declaring their projects and aligned to the plan. The capital expenditure framework is a component that's demanded by the MSA in terms of the SDFs. And then, of course, remedial proactive actions for our open spaces and water courses. Then finally, my final slide here, Ashraf, and I'm done. This is really where I think we need to get to in terms of the public sector, and I'll leave you with what I think the private sector, the public planning fraternity, those on this call need to think about. Firstly, coherent messaging, leadership program and funding. I don't think we've got any degree of coherence. The district or one plan has thrown, I think, a major spanner into all of the planning works. Again, huge enthusiasm at one period in time, and now silence, unless I'm missing the email chain. Meaningful provincial and national plans that are aligned with funding to the plans of the metros and municipalities. And I've used their phrase from a mentor of mine back in the day, Greater Pretoria Metro Council in Gauteng. Eamon Beneke was the chief planner at some stage there at Greater Pretoria. He kept asking then in 1999, where's the provincial IDP? Where's the provincial IDP? Now I'm just saying, please again, Google whilst you're online there. Go and find me the provincial IDP for anywhere in the country. Please send it through when you've got it. I'd love to read it, and I'd really love to know if it exists. A genuine recognition that time is running out. We saw last year what the country is capable of when it puts its most negative mind to it. We're almost 2 generations on, 2 born-free generations on from '94. Yet what really has improved in our spatial and economic efficiency, the lives of our most vulnerable community? I don't know. In fact, I would argue that in certain instances it's deteriorated, which with all of the effort and all these plans, it's a really shocking indictment. And then finally, let's not forget the planning fraternity. And I'm saying this to all of you, 100 plus on the call. What is our role in advocacy on this and in our doing, the way that we carry ourselves as a profession? How do we engage with these opportunities and processes? And I've seen all of the above, or what follows. I've seen the passive, I've seen dismissive, I've seen those that are hugely enthusiastic, I've seen those who are just completely dogmatic, just follow the... So all of those are approaches which I've seen. What are reflections on what have worked and not worked? Now that's where I'd really love to hear in the conversation what our understanding of this is. How are we advocating for change, and what is it we as a professional collective are proposing, and how will we be judged on our efforts? I'll leave you, of course, with our great friends Calvin and Hobbs. Thanks a lot, Ashraf. That's all from my side, sir.
I'm exhausted. I think, Pete, what you've done is, for me, raise 2 things. You've explained and provided really nice graphics of this enormous complexity that we are sitting with. And so the question arises, do we need that complexity? And I asked that question specifically in one of your first points that you made, is what's the ambition? You know, I see Cecil is on the line here, and Cecil, very early on in our business partnership, said, Ashraf, if you do not bring a normative approach to your work, in other words, what is it you are trying to do, whether it's in this part of Heidelberg or that part of Bishop's Court or whatever it is, what's your normative, and I would call it an ideological position, then you're really not going to come up with anything. You're just going to come up with generic stuff. And I think that's where we have become stuck, because we are sitting in the end of history kind of environment, sitting with a lot of history. We sit with complexity, but it's not taking us anywhere. And so really, thank you very much for putting that up. And I think that is for us the big challenge as we go forward. Catherine, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. I should have gone first. That would have been a lot easier. I won't be long, Ashraf. I think Dion and Pete have really sketched out the challenges and some key questions around, how does the system give clarity, and how does it promote consistent decision making across the value chain of planning, budgeting, and implementation, and is it creating an enabling environment for development, and how do we avoid every single development decision, whether it be for infrastructure investment or development approval, having to negotiate the parameters every single time. And maybe this does call for a system that is perhaps not ignoring the complexity that we face, but making some judgment calls about what's most important to our society right now. And unfortunately, I feel as a South African society that we are going in the other direction. We are trying to tick all the boxes. We are trying to tick all the boxes that the rest of the world are doing in their kind of journey of human rights and all these things. And not that I'm suggesting this is not all about human rights, but I just feel we are trying to do too much, and we designed a system that actually is not for us and where we're at right now. And you know, but there are elements of the system that we're also not taking advantage of. And maybe we need to hone in on those. And Peter's already picked up on those around a capital expenditure framework. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But maybe it's also worth just delving a little bit into the realpolitik of IDPs and MSDFs, or at least my perspective on them. And that is, you know, that Dion suggests that the planners were the biggest players in the IDP space. They're not. They're very peripheral to the IDP space. And I guess that's purposeful on the part of the increasing centralization and politicization of IDP formulation. And so, you know, the IDP is a 5-year term of office implementation plan that really should draw its programming from all of the long-term strategic documents and frameworks, like the MSDF, like the utility sector plans, like an economic development strategy, etc. And perhaps most importantly, or as important, the long-term financial plan. But and so by definition, it needs to make some choices about what are the priorities in the 5 years and what is going to be done. And those are mostly guided by the election manifesto, and I guess a certainty about what can be delivered. But those choices, it's quite difficult politically to make those explicit, and so it doesn't often make them very explicit, and much is left unsaid, and what that does is to, in a sense, reverberate through the institution and persist a habit of muddling through and reinterpretation at all the different points. And then that is exacerbated in this kind of messy decision-making environment around daily pressures of emergencies, crises, lobbies, and now, of course, demands on social media that beach huts get upgraded as a matter of absolute urgency. So, and I say that tongue in cheek, but you know, that is the kind of reality of how decisions are making. So, and the IDP process is a highly, highly centralized, politically very centralized process. So planners have to fight quite hard for the space to say, hey, you know, this is the journey that our long-term frameworks have sketched out. How are we working towards that? But then let's turn to, well, are we setting up a system that really empowers the IDP? And you know, a challenge was put to me by one of my colleagues this morning, for which I'm very grateful I did, and that is, you know, is the SDF doing enough? And if any of us who've tried to write an SDF, it's a mammoth task, it's a hugely difficult task. But let's be honest, as planners, we try and find the middle ground, and we tend to stick at the level of principle, and we are trained in framework planning that tries to leave choice, but set some parameters. The problem is, does that give enough clarity, and does it allow us a set of instruments to be set up that create accountability in the system of decision-making further down the line? And arguably not. So to some extent, maybe, let's say, but we can see how MSDFs themselves have been kind of more nuanced in order to create more flexibility in the system to suit particular interests. And the MSDF, it plays in a very difficult space, arguably even more difficult than the IDP, because that is where the real contested interests, where the money sits, where the patronage sits, where the opportunities sit, where there's much to be gained, but there's also much to be lost. And so it's a very difficult space where people are quite reluctant to draw very firm lines that are firm enough that when they take decisions further down the line, they can be held accountable against those. So this is where, for me, an instrument like the capital expenditure framework becomes so important. and why, we're drumming this a lot in our work right now with municipalities, because what we're missing is something that says, right, this is how we understand the city's going to grow. And this is what it means for utility services, both in terms of backlogs and new growth and new demand. This is the infrastructure we require to accommodate that growth in this sequence in these locations. And this is what we have to budget for. And a lot of that homework has been done. A lot of that research has been done. We know a lot of this, and I was quite taken aback when Pete reminded us of the work that we were already presenting in 2007. Because then we have an instrument as society, broader society, as partners in development, to hold the IDP and the budget to account, to say, okay, so in year 3 of your budget, which is really the entry point for any big development project, insofar as the outside world can see in municipal planning for infrastructure, is this project coming on stream? Because it needs to come on stream, because now we know you need that investment at this point in time to accommodate that growth. And so the CEF becomes a really critical sort of like second generation BEP, but perhaps more specific about holding the institution to account for what investment will be made, and being able to then track that through the budget. Recognizing that there are a whole lot of supporting systems behind the scenes in a municipality that needs to make sure those projects are ready to go onto the budget, and what is happening in that space. So there are some missing parts of our system that we aren't fully exploiting, and we have to push quite hard as the broader community to make sure municipalities do use them, do develop them, and do make them clear, and don't obfuscate them in further frameworks and prioritization criteria and things that still leave uncertainty around the decisions around what will be invested in, when, and where, in relation to enabling infrastructure. And, this is where I think we've got an opportunity to guard against keeping that space vague, because we can't afford to keep that space vague. We can't afford to keep that at the level of principle. Our society, our cities, our towns, our developments need that kind of certainty, as Dion has pointed out. And it means then we can avoid the kind of day-to-day negotiations. Of course, that doesn't remove the fact that there, as Pete pointed out, there are critical pieces of infrastructure over which towns and cities have absolutely no control, but are actually absolutely central to the performance of that city and town. And transport and road and rail networks are core to that. The cooperative governance system isn't working because it sits at the edge of planning, and it doesn't actually sit in the space of budgeting. So government, other spheres of government don't play any role in the budgeting decisions of PRASA. What is it prioritizing, where, according to what plans? And as long as that persists, this notion of cooperative governance and co-planning is a fairly academic one. And so the system there also needs to change. And so, yeah, I think we need to, when we just get into the specifics of the kind of questions we were asked for this talk around the relationship between the IDP and the SDF and the budget, we need to understand how they fit and the roles they play. But the key question is around, are we perhaps, in addition to the CFs, in the MSDFs themselves as spatial planners, are they doing enough in terms of taking up the challenge presented in Spluma around truly navigating the risk management, the trade-offs, the conflict management, and building that consensus as a social compact that we talk about the SDF playing that role to pave the way for easier delivery? And like, Ade pointed out this morning to me, is the MSDF reducing the transaction costs enough that it's attractive for the IDP to really follow the cue of the MSDF? This is no easy task. This is years of planning. This is hectic work on the part of planners. and it's painful, and it's really difficult to do. And it does start to beg the question, are we talking about framework planning anymore, or do we need something perhaps a little bit more definitive? And are we fully exploiting the role the MSDF can play in leading the land use management system, again, in order to start reducing transaction costs? And, I do think there's light in the sense of what the City of Cape Town is trying to do in its MSDF and district plans around getting much more specific about what the incentives are going to be attached to certain parts of the city in order to achieve certain outcomes. And again, then start to remove the transaction costs later down the line. Yeah, so I really, Dion has really sketched the bigger picture here, and the kind of core concerns that we're facing as a society, and Pete has elaborated on that. And perhaps to get into, I've got into a bit more of an operational space around where does the system actually create opportunities, but where is it perhaps also mitigating against creating the conditions for growth? And I don't think even Dion would suggest that growth is at all costs. I think we as a planning community understand that growth is sustainable growth, but that itself is difficult, and trade-offs do need to be made. And, are we actually doing our job as planners of negotiating those trade-offs early enough so that it's easier for the IDP to take on a particular development path, or attractive, or the IDP itself is incentivized to follow the MSDF because it's de-risked a whole delivery program where the results can be seen in the 5 years. And then perhaps the question is, have we really taken up the task of Splumer that says, well, was it Splumer or the MSA that says the MSDF must be translated into a 5-year plan in the IDP? We don't really do that. We summarize the MSDF. Do we articulate our MSDF in a series of 5-year implementation plans that make it quite difficult for the IDP to go in a different direction, because that's now articulated, it's been approved, it's signed off by society. And, are we missing some opportunities in the system there? While we also need to ask some questions around whether parts of the system are working. Ashraf, I think there's been so much said, and I think the discussion is going to be so interesting. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm exhausted. I think that the points you raised, I picked up about 10 or 11 points that you've raised, and there's a consistent theme that you're bringing in is, what's the value of what we are doing, even though we are doing it because we have to do it. And that one particular question, well, two particular questions: are planners making enough use of the Splumer opportunities? And lastly, what's the value of the system, or what value does the system add? And I think that's quite something that's worth taking forward, and things like that. The questions that also arose for me while all three speakers were talking, I'm just going to go through them as thought points, and people can pick them up. You don't have to pick them up, But this whole issue of democracy and development seems to come out all the time. The issue that we haven't covered, I think Pete might have covered it, is what's changing. If we know the climate is changing, how does that impact on other things in the industry? What is the technology and services impacts? Is what we are trying to do appropriate? Do we even have the skills to do that? Are our approaches appropriate to our needs? I think that's quite a thing. I don't think Cathy was asking that in a right-wing kind of way, to say that we are trying to do what the rest of the world is doing. And I think we must do what the rest of the world is doing, but we must do it in a manner in which our. And so I think the question is what we are doing, is the way we are doing it the correct way? And by the way, I support seismic surveys. Just to let you know that. Does local government have too much autonomy, is a question that rose in my mind as three speakers were talking. Should National Treasury be determining policy and processes and expenditure in the way they are? And I say this as a supporter of what Treasury had been doing up until about 5 years ago, because if it weren't for them, we'd be in a worse position. And so I do think that Treasury has played an important role, but is their role now being regressive or progressive? Something that's come for me. The issue of money, patronage, and power still comes up, and it came up in all three presentations in some way or the other. What hasn't come up is the impact and the presence of structural unemployment in the way in which we plan, in the way in which we do our planning. And then, is there an opportunity for blue sky planning while muddling through based on some kind of ideological or normative position? Because I really do think if you don't have an ideology, if you don't stand for something, then you are part of the people whose dominant ideology you are implementing. And so what would you change, as speakers and as participants in this group? And in that, what would you change? What laws are actually the problems? So I leave it open to you. I didn't see many questions, but I did see one. I did see my friend Mark's being quoted by Gerard that says it's not laws, policies, and plans that achieve sustainable development, but rather people making use of laws, policies, plans, and that achieve sustainable development. And I agree with that, actually, but it's a very contextual thing. So I'm going to hand over. I see Cecil had his hand up. I think it's the only hand so far. I'm going to give to him. And then at some point in time, I'm going to have about 2 or 3 times when the speakers come in. So let's go for the first round of questions and comments. And then we have the speakers come in, and we go for another round and then of questions, and we get the speakers come back in, and then we'll get them conclude after a third round of questions. Cecil?
Come in, lower my hand. Hi, Ashraf, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Great, yeah, great. Continue, Cecil.
Okay. I wanna. I mean, it's quite a complex kind of discussion that we're gonna get into, and to see how the heck do we lower this hand. And I want to maybe this is lower. Maybe try to cut through it, and actually wanna kind of maybe adjust to kind of align myself to what when Dion started off the discussion, and I think I maybe also somebody that has spent, I suppose, 3 decades, in this kind of mission, trying to change planning in places we live in. Yeah, Pete, I mean, we all started planning in 1990, when apartheid was kind of just being taken apart. And we all had plans, we had 20-year visions. We're going to change the cities in 20-year visions. So we're obviously way past that. And we're going to second level kind of rounds of trying to change things around. I think we might too. I think the point we are in society at the moment, sort of what happened also around the state and state capture. I think maybe the chance also provides there's a chance for us to rethink about the state and the developmental state. And I think in order for us to have a better understanding of that, it might be a good idea to actually understand a little bit about what the state is and how the state operates. And I would recommend, some readings on that, on governmentality and the state. This is Mitchell Dean, Seeing the State. This is by Corbridge. And then also James Scott, Seeing Like a State. And also there's some excellent work by Lee about the world to governmentality. And basically, to sum it up, is basically that if you look at the state and how the modern state operates, ironically, if you're looking at a communist society, Soviet Union, America, there's a lot of similarities between the state. And I think Lee sort of talks about it quite well when she talks about the will of the state. So what it actually means is that once you put a government together, it automatically starts to operate in the way where it wants to govern. It creates systems, it creates procedures, it creates categories, it just operates, it becomes an animal in itself, which wants to count, it wants to allocate, it wants to number, it wants to control. And that's the nature of a state if it was in capitalist USA, even Soviet Union. And I think that's part of the problem is sitting this, that we don't recognize that the state, for example, in a developing country like South Africa and US and maybe even in Ukraine, which is quite a developed country, is completely different. The demands are completely different. And we do have a strong developmental angle to it. So in my mind, and I'm going to obviously simplify this, in my mind, the state has kind of got 3 kind of broad responsibilities. The one is administration and sort of service delivery. It's just making sure the systems, the numbers, the ID, all that kind of administration is done. And also the services, actually put in services there. Making sure the water, sewer, electrical stuff, all that stuff just runs and operates. For me, that's not development. That's by no means development. It's just a state making sure it operates in kind of functions. Then the second kind of part of what I regard an important part of the state is this very important part of planning and visioning and blue sky thinking and thinking ahead. And that's very critical, I think, for the state to do that. And that's obviously where planning finds itself in very, very well and tends to operate in, and etc. And there's nothing, and this is a critical part we actually need to have, and it's sort of where we're going and what is the normative values we're driving our decisions, etc. But I think there's a third part of the state that we completely haven't really appreciated and neglected, which is more the kind of developmental part, which is sort of the development side of it. And the best examples that we've had, and actually would like to hear you comment about it, Ashraf, because you've been in that space, is about development agencies. And I think we've completely really, and I think there's some good examples, there's some bad examples, but there's also great examples where the state and together with the private sector have been operating in developmental agencies. So in my mind, in my ideal world, what I would have is rethinking the state. And I would split the state into two kind of components. The one is kind of the administrative, the part of it, and maybe three components, I suppose. The one is the visioning and one is the developmental side of it. And the problem is that, for example, we argue that developmental states should operate at the level of municipalities. And then we throw it all in one box. Now, the problem is that, yes, there might be different departments, like in city, you've got forward planning, you've got land use management. That's completely different people. I mean, I've been my entire career in forward planning, and I managed to operate a little bit in the municipal tribunal and getting close to land use planning. And it's completely different people, different personalities, different outlook on life. One are maybe bean counters and watching the legislation and the bylaws and different regulations. And the other one is a much more different kind of person, which is developmental and orientated, more developmental orientated. And we throw it all together in municipality, we package it in a so-called IDP and SDF, or whatever I want to call it, and we send it up to the committees, and the mayoral committees need to then decide upon it. Now, you're asking a politician. You're asking sorry, Ashraf?
Can you round up, Cecil? I know you're an academic.
Okay. So basically where I'm going is, you're interrupting. Okay, you're cutting me now. Okay. I think where I'm going is that I think it's an important discussion. And I think the discussion that we are having and where we're going, and maybe I'm hoping to get support from Dewan, is that I think the comments that I've received and the input I've received is basically trying to ask the question, how do we fix up, how do we improve the current system? And what I'm trying to put forward is that the current system is fundamentally problematic. And we need to separate out the state in its different responsibilities. And then I think as a response, maybe as a last word from me, I'd like to hear from you, Ashraf. I mean, having spent a little bit more time in developmental agency space, what have been your experience? So I'm a bit worried if we're going to say, how do we, I mean, I hate the word alignment. If we say the problem is we need to align, we need to improve, we need to rethink what planning role is. I think it's, I think that's a dead end. And that's the same kind of problem you'll find in the US, in the UK, anywhere in the world. And I think the problem is we're trying to create, try to solve problems within one room. And I think it's problematic because the room in itself, it's quite complex, and it's got different components that will not change. And in itself, it's an animal that it's about the world government that exists that undermines other components. Let me stop. Okay.
No, thank you very much, Cecil. I think, I mean, that's really, I mean, besides it being a mouthful, it's a headful that brings us to the question of, again, is the system appropriate for us? Anyone else who wants to come in? Any of the speakers can also come in, by the way. I see someone else has raised their hand. Please come in, whoever you are.
Aniela Horn from Stellenbosch University. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I actually just wanted to respond to what Cathy said, and I found it very interesting and very contemporary at the moment. During the week, I was also confronted with some very interesting research that's being done in Tanzania with regards to this idea of piecemeal planning and what the major achievements have been of piecemeal planning in a place like Tanzania. Now, obviously, there's always this double-sided or double-edged sword of piecemeal planning being both a beauty and a beast. So on the one hand, you have piecemeal planning taking place and it sees a lot of stuff happening and a lot of houses being built. But at the other end of the scale, it's not being coordinated. And what I'm consistently seeing happening in parts of the global south, or in developing countries, if you want to call it that, is this idea of a municipality or a local government becoming more and more, if I can put it that way, almost playing a purely administrative role and almost being sidelined from development processes, while the actual development is being handed over to NGOs, community-based organizations, private planners, and that sort of thing. So because of the strictness or perceived strictness of municipal planning or master planning, people are starting to operate outside of that category and almost shunting local authorities from the development process, which I think is inherently problematic in a country such as ours. And I don't, unfortunately, have the answer to that. But Cathy, I think one thing that you did say, which to me was very valuable, is perhaps it's a place to start saying, let's, as a local authority or as a province, commit to 3 or 4 things that we are adamant about and provide the confines for the way those things should happen, instead of trying to provide a catch-all. And I know you also asked the question of whether the spatial development framework is actually doing enough, but maybe it's trying to do too much. So maybe it's, I'm not saying that it's being overly prescriptive, but I'm just saying that perhaps it's also trying to achieve too much and being too prescriptive on all aspects of the city. So perhaps by targeting 3 or 4 things, we can kind of start working in the direction of bringing different people together. Thanks.
Wonderful. Dion, you want to come in?
Thanks, Ashraf. I've got to come in for 2 reasons. One, I've got to comment, and 2, I've got to excuse myself in the next 15 minutes. But I think Anil is asking a very interesting question, and indirectly, I think Cecil asked the same question. Why do we plan? And the answer surely must be, we plan so that people can do what they need to do easier and in a respectful way to their fellow citizens. That's the only reason why we plan. Okay, so if NGOs in Tanzania or in South America or wherever are starting to bypass, and it's actually happening in South Africa, and I'll come back to that point right now. If we are bypassing government, the question must surely be asked, why is it necessary to bypass government? Now, we've spoken about the complexity of planning, and I think Pete's graphics showed it very, very well. You know, it's actually amazing that anything comes out of the production line at the end. You know, we plan for planning's sake. We don't know why we plan. And I think the question right now is, because we haven't asked ourselves why and what are we planning, we've allowed Treasury to do what it's done in the last couple of years. I mean, for anybody who's seen the Treasury note on public procurement, for example, National Treasury pulled up the handbrake on all public procurement because of uncertainty on a judgment. Now that's got nothing to do with planning, but it's a culture. It's a culture of centralism, and we shall tell you what is right for yourself. Now, I'm going to throw a serious stone in the pond and say, as planners, we are probably some of the most centralist thinkers in our academic training, and quite frankly, in terms of ego. If we were facilitative, then we would not have this conversation, because we would be acutely attuned to the people needs out there. And people needs change as economic growth takes place, as education standards change, as health standards change, all of those things. But our way of planning is happening in spite of the people out there. Now, I'm not saying for one moment there shouldn't be planning. I'm on record on this, and I also believe that there is a very important role for research to inform planning. But I've really got to ask the question, what are we training as planners in this country? And what do planners think their job are? How do we measure the success of planning? Right? And again, I get back to where we are as a developing state. If the core measurement is not growth, i.e. economic growth leading to job creation, right? And if any planning application cannot speak to those 2 points as the primary point of departure, knowing that we've got to look after the environment, knowing that we've got to look after heritage, you know, those things are not up for debate. We've got to do it. But we've lost the hierarchy. So that then raises the question, Ashraf, is a planner a facilitator or a dictator? And I think that is what the profession needs to ask itself right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point at which I'd like to refer to Cathy, because I see there are two other people with hands up. Catherine is one of them. Catherine, when you do come in, I see you've agreed with Dr. Horn in the chat, but if you could also just respond to some of the points that Dion has just raised, and whatever other points you'd like to raise yourself. Cathy, the floor is yours.
Sorry, must I speak, Ashraf, or is there somebody else in
Yes,
front of me? Sorry about that.
your hand was up, but also I saw in the chat that you had agreed with Dr. Horn. And if you heard some of the points that Dion had raised, they were also going in that kind of direction. And I always thought maybe you would just like to comment on that and whatever else you were planning to comment on since your hand was up.
Can anyone hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can
hear you.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, thanks. I think.
Shall we give Cathy? I think you are buffering a little bit, and I'm just wondering maybe we give somebody else an opportunity, and then you come back in once you settle down, once your thing has settled down. Hello, unless you're fine now, Cathy. Yeah, I think she's fine. Cathy, please proceed.
Sure. I'm hearing everything fine, so I'm just not sure if okay. So yeah. Yeah. So in response to Dion, I think the planners take a lot of flack for stuff that is not always the planners making the decisions. So in local government, the systems are designed in part by leaders, by councillors, by politicians. The processes of delegation, the processes of what application is required for what, the processes of deciding actually this doesn't need an application is not the planner's decision. It's a political decision, and I think there's a tension inside political leadership around wanting to deregulate and to regulate, because the roots of political leadership sit in ratepayers. So this notion that the kind of the challenge that Dion has placed on the planner, I think we need to recognize that the planner is a much bigger community than qualified town and regional planners. It's a whole decision-making structure inside municipalities where actually, and quite often, planners play a very minor role. So I think, just not to sound defensive, but I think we have to understand where some of the rules get set, and it's not about the planners dictating. Quite often, it's about the origins of political leadership sitting in ratepayer communities, and the decisions that get made around who can make what kind of decisions and what decisions are needed. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Daniele that we need to make choices, and I suppose the question for me, maybe, Ashraf, is if we were to take a very honest and hard look at the economic, fiscal, and social reality of this country right now, and the resources that we have available, and the position we sit in the global economy, and how little we've actually achieved post-1994 in sort of spatial transformation, would we design the system differently? What would we focus on as our priorities? And that's, sometimes I feel there's a massive gap, and I think Dion's pointing to this as well, between policy and the reality that our citizens are living with. That is quite stark and almost regressive to think that, when I graduated and joined the city of Cape Town, we were looking forward to the rollout of new rolling stock. How shameful is that? We don't even have a viable railway line now. We've regressed. Oh, let's be honest about it. So how do we change? Does the system work for that? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Pete?
Thanks, Ashraf. And these are some of the sort of comments that are not necessarily directly responding to the comments that have preceded, but I'm just sort of reminded by what has been discussed now that, let's not kid ourselves that, planning, particularly in other parts of the world, is a hugely important and politically, basically, planning wins you elections in certain parts of the world, particularly in parts of the United States. Hugely important in terms of setting agendas and driving a particular outcome. I'm reminded of a conversation in my early days here in Cape Town when one of the most senior planners in the land use space basically said, spatial planning is dead. It has no place here. It's no longer functional. And as somebody who'd just come down, having spent his career working in that in a Gauteng perspective, it was quite a wake-up call. And I wanted to understand, why do you say that? And at the end of, a whole list of reasons why, and particularly pointing to some of the inconsistencies in the decision-making within Cape Town over that period, I was reminded, and in fact, it took one of the young interns to remind us all, I think, in that room of why planning is important. And I'll get to that as the last point. On the one hand, it's saying it's establishing the rules of the game. How do we understand the norms and the values that we're putting? And those increasingly need to be based on not just the formal environment, but the informal, which is very much shaping whatever we want to talk about new cities. And I'm not talking about Port Shepstone or Lanseria nonsense. I'm talking about the cities that are going to hold the majority of our future growth in population. It's a declaration of intent. It's about saying this is what we stand for. It's about that element of saying we're clear on these approaches and these principles. And the way that the intern at that stage described it was a social contract between the city, the profession, in this instance, the planning profession, and the communities. And I think that's hugely important, because I think if you don't have that, you operate in a vacuum. And as long as we have the law of the land, you will have something like a planning scheme, a development management scheme, call it what you will. If you take away the policy element, the planning and the intentions and the aspirations defined in things like the municipal spatial framework and ultimately in the IDP, etc., it leaves you with a zoning scheme that says this is what you can do and you can do nothing more. You can never have a debate about, well, in terms of policy, we are pushing a particular approach here. And I think that's an important thing to remember. What does this environment look like if you take away the policy, take away the strategic intent, take away the principles that are embedded within SPLUMA? And again, I always say, how do you dismiss those principles in SPLUMA? They're there for a very good reason. And it's our job as this profession to continue to try and undo the damage that this profession did for many decades before 1994. And we don't seem to have had a proper response as a collective at this stage between the private and the public sector. And I think it's high time that we started to be able to show a lot more delivery, a lot more change in the work that we've done. And that's, I say, that's across the board. That's not just about us as the municipality or City of Cape Town or Pete the planner in Cape Town. It's us as a collective. What are we doing? I've talked about this in other places around saying I think we're at an absolute crisis point around our professional responsibilities, about our ethical framework, about what we're doing in terms of advocacy as a collective. And I say there are individuals, there are groups. I say again, big ups to SAPI for getting this amount of people on the call on a work time, and more strength. And this sort of discussion shouldn't be the end of it, but really the rebirth post. Is there such a thing as post-COVID yet? I don't know, but basically saying what are we going to do from 2022? I asked the question during the height of COVID, saying what the hell are we doing as planning in responding to this? Dion, I think we had a conversation during that period when I was asking. I've spoken to a number of you on this call about saying we seem to have no radar. We should have been leading a lot of those conversations during those terrible months post-March 2020, where no one had a clue what was coming. One thing we knew for sure is it wasn't good news. But as a planning fraternity, where were we in that debate? We were nowhere. Everyone else was leading the conversation. And as a collective, we were absent whilst supposedly on duty. I know we had our own issues, each of our families, each of our collectives, but I think we were found wanting. And again, relevance. On the one hand, we're talking about relevance of planning frameworks and documents. I'm asking a more existential question of what's the relevance of us as a profession at this stage. So I think we've been found wanting. Thank you.
Pete, can I take you up on that? I mean, and Pete doesn't have to answer the question, but I want to take us up. I want to take all of us up on the point Pete has just raised in the last 2-3 minutes, and ask ourselves the question: are we looking backward? Are we trying to undo apartheid instead of looking at the opportunities in South Africa in the 21st and 22nd centuries? Because it appears to me, if you look at our systems, if you look at our planning, if you look at the nomenclature, the languages and things that we use, we seem to be always looking back, and we're comparing ourselves with the past and doing so quite badly. I mean, 40% pass rate in a school, I mean, is a disaster. No, it would make for wood happy. But we seem to be looking backwards instead of looking forward in what could be. And even when we look forward in terms of what could be, we're comparing ourselves to other countries that are not necessarily contextual to ours. Is that part of our problem, that we're trying to do something that is almost impossible and therefore we are not moving forward, not moving ahead in some way? I put that to everybody. Anybody can answer that question. I don't know who wants to come in.
Ashraf, I'm going to jump in there because I'm about to run out.
Please do.
You raise a very important point. What have we been planning for? Now, if we have been planning, as Cathy mentioned, that many of us thought we would be doing, planning for the integration of South African urban areas again, then we have failed dismally. How many bridges have we built across the proverbial Berlin walls in the Cape Town area, Stellenbosch, Drakenstein, any of the other municipalities? The answer is none. We are sustaining apartheid planning. We get emotive and we have reactionary movements to try and create opportunities, and we should for poorer people in so-called have areas or exclusive areas. But what have we actually done to create new growth opportunities in poorer communities as well in parallel? And the answer is nothing. Okay, so we have paid lip service in this country to integrated planning. And I think as a profession, the profession needs to do introspection and answer that. Have we changed apartheid planning or have we sustained apartheid planning? That's the first point. My submission is we have actively sustained apartheid planning. We will allow people with a similar economic profile to live next to us. So we're happy with the color breakdown, but we are unfortunately not dissimilar to Brazil, where we have economic discrimination versus racial discrimination as our future. That's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is, and I'm going to be critical of academia, and I'm going to be critical of theoretical planning. We have not used the tools available to implement in this country. We have treated the private sector as the pariah, right? You see it at a plethora of levels. You see it in the way that the perception is created that every developer is driving around in a Porsche. He's not. She's not. We see it in development contribution policies. The private sector will pay the tax, right? Now, I'm not saying the private sector shouldn't make its contribution, but when you are thinking multi-generationally and you're thinking about uplifting an economy and broadening a tax base, and you can earn rates and taxes ad infinitum if you plan and implement infrastructure successfully, and we wouldn't be having a debate about short-term taxation. As Prof. Brian Kant has pointed out, Cape Town can leverage 800 billion rand on the international market based on its assets register and its balance sheet. Money is not the problem, right? So this opportunistic way of trying to force somebody else to build the city versus everybody rolling up their sleeves together and start breaking down the barriers and start building. And I think this is part of our problem. We have academically been trained to break down the apartheid city. We were not given the tools. We do not understand the tools. When I, at academic level, raised the issue of how does a feasibility work, I was told that I'm in the wrong class. Right? Now, this is the reality. We've got to start using the tools. And the tools are out there, but it means that we've got to stop this thing of them and us. We're in government, we'll tell you guys on the private sector what to do. We're in the private sector, get stuffed, we'll do our own thing, i.e. Tanzania. So we will have to find a way of identifying the tools. Money is not the issue in this country. If it was, we would have closed the doors a long time ago. It is the ability to use the energy and the planning ability of professionals that can straddle the line between public and private sector and translate. And I think that is where the profession should be going. Facilitator of conversations. Thanks, Ashraf. I've unfortunately got to excuse myself.
Sure. Catherine, before I let you come in, would you mind if I let, and please excuse my pronunciation, Aditunji Adibayo. If we can let Aditunji Adibayo come in, and then after that will be Catherine.
Thank you. I'm not sure if
yes, we can hear you.
Seen me.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we see you and hear you.
So I think very quickly, firstly, I couldn't agree more with Dion. And I'm also going to touch on some of the things that Cathy also mentioned earlier. So I think Pete's done a very good job of sketching out the landscape, which is very protracted, it's complex, the context is difficult and all that. But I think to a very large extent, this is the reality, and we have to accept it and deal with it. I think people who are familiar with literature will understand the idea of modeling through as a given, and the fact that sometimes what you have to do as planners in an environment where you have to model through is that you have to do mixed scanning as opposed to having rational synoptic approaches to plans. And I think us as planners, we need to go back to understanding the challenges to our normative way of looking at how to do planning in the past and what that has meant for how planning has evolved over time, and the fact that we're probably stuck in a particular way of looking at planning. So what that means is we need to challenge ourselves again. And this is where the point that Dion made sort of resonates very, very deeply. In a very protracted environment where there are multiple interests, the planner's self-image continues to be the guy who, and I say planner as the professional town and regional planner, not the broader planning community, which extends beyond trained planners. The idea is still to impose a plan and to say this is how we envision development and all of that. And I think Dion is spot on. I mean, when an environment where we are thinking about putting a new infrastructure framework on the table, and you ask yourself a question, where is business in this conversation? In fact, quite frankly, we're talking about job creation. I was saying to the colleagues in discussion, if you put organized manufacturing together in one room, just the chief operation officers of organized manufacturing, just maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 CEO that would be implementable. And then the role of government is to make sure that government social objectives actually met via the process. Now, because they understand all the supply chains, they understand all the logistics, they understand everything that is required. So the point of the matter is, firstly, we need to understand that the way to, and we speak this language every time, language collaborative, but what does that really mean? And that takes us to my next point. in that kind of environment, you cannot do everything. It's practically impossible. And you need to understand that we cannot align everything because not everything requires alignment. And the issue then becomes, what are the issues that require us to clarify, to provide clarity for decision making? And how do we progressively, as a collective, try and understand? Because these are oftentimes very wicked problems. You know, how do we progressively, jointly come together and try and understand the problem and collectively act? Now, the issue is when you're able to narrow the issues across space, it's easy for you to, well, I say easy, but the fact is it's relatively easy for you to pull together the range of interests that can frame the problem and provide the solution across the various government programs and commit to it, because oftentimes everybody is joining the hip with everybody else when there's a wicked problem. And you know for a fact that you cannot solve it alone. And this for me is where the opportunity lies for planning in this kind of complex environment. The idea of comprehensive planning needs to be dropped because it's not useful. It's useful in a centralist state or a socialist state that tries to do it, but in a democratic planning context, that is not useful. And when we say democracy, we're not just talking about, you know, the public. It's also government, the business, civil society that has to come together. You know, so in that kind of environment, it's a different kind of skill, and that's what I suppose Dion is trying to stress. That how does the planner become a facilitator as opposed to being a dictator? Because that requires a different self-image and a different skill set, you know, which requires exploration and sense making and facilitating different people around clearly defined issues or set of issues. And I think this is the future of spatial planning and our contribution. And by the way, I'm going to just end with this. When a land use application comes forward, typically what happens is you have to take a particular application via a range of stakeholders that are affected by the particular application: transport, heritage, environment. All of this people basically have to come together and try to understand the contestation as far as development is concerned. Now that is easier at the site level, but then imagine that you have an SDF that is able to actually identify contentious issues that overlap a range of policy areas. And this is an approach that has been coming to the fore that sees spatial planning as a policy field. Then you're able basically to front load where the contentions are and collectively deal with those issues together with all the stakeholders involved and document the agreements in the SDF. Because what that then does is by the time you get to decision making around development, decision makers already have a reference point. But that is a different kind of planning. It's not comprehensive planning. So it's about finding opportunities to add value, decision making in the land use side in terms of land development and for public sector investment. And that requires a different mindset and a shift in orientation as to how we go about doing this. I'm going to just leave it there. But modeling through and mixed scanning is the opportunity, is the environment we operate in, and it's a given. We cannot run away from it. Thanks.
I did my planning course in 1989, 1990, I think. And we did the theory on the art of modeling through, and I'm glad to see that it is still contemporary, because I certainly believe in that myself. Before I hand over to Catherine and to Pete to close us up, is there anyone else who would like to come in? Anyone else before I hand over to Catherine and to Pete? Going once, twice. Oh, they are, yes. Gerard.
Hi, everybody.
Gerard, come in.
Yeah, I just really wanted to thank everybody for a great session. And as I've indicated in the chat, do not underestimate what's possible and what we've already done. It's just about scaling up and replicating, and certainly accelerating some of the things that we have already started doing in certain places. And critical is really an insight from lean management that it's a lot easier it's difficult to, with a new way of thinking, get to a new way of doing. It's through a new way of doing that the new way of thinking is embedded. And therefore, let's just get on with the doing. Cathy and Directorate is already there. They're focusing on those things that drive the implementation rather than planning products for the sake of planning products. And therefore, this is an exciting space we're entering into, but it will take the partnership between the private sector, the academia, the officialdom. But let's get on with the doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, I hand over to you for your last word, and then Pete for his last word.
Thanks, Ashraf. I think for me, it's rather an appeal. What struck me when Dion spoke his last point is that what we seem to have in common is a victim complex. The planners say developers are pariahs, or treat developers as pariahs. Developers, planners are worried because we think that we're not facilitative and that we're dictators, and I think neither are anywhere close to the truth. I don't know any of my planning colleagues who think developers are pariahs. Some behave badly, but mostly don't. And they do amazing things that we can't as local government even imagine doing as well as they do. So I find that, I guess my appeal is, let's stop doing that. Let's stop labeling each other in ways that create hostility, that create space and distance that it's very difficult to overcome when we're all trying to grapple with similar problems from different angles. And we call each other out on that and say, is that useful for a constructive conversation on how to solve a problem? Whose interest is it serving to set us up against each other? Actually, maybe that's not true. I don't think that these labels that we're giving each other today are useful or constructive or true, really. And I think we've got to kind of mature into all applying our intellectual energy to agreeing on what the problem is, and actually applying our intellectual energy on how to solve it, and the mechanics of that, and realizing who's better to solve what kind of problems, and recognizing our limits in the different professions or different fields. So that's really just my appeal going forward, Ashraf. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that's a very nice way to end your contribution, Catherine. Pete?
Yeah, colleagues, really nothing much to add. I've sort of had a chance to give a sort of logical approach to it through the presentation, and again, thank you for affording me that opportunity. I've also had a bit of a rant towards the back end around where I think we could do more and some of the challenges. And look, the bottom line, as we know, is that the challenges are not going away; they are compounding. I left out a whole number of slides around, that complexity around. 4 years ago, we were in a height of the drought crisis, and it's almost unimaginable that things could have gotten worse, and then along came COVID. And so this idea that we as the sort of planning fraternity need to be on the front line, whether we're in the public or the private sector, we need to be responsive. I think that's been made very, very clear. We need to, I think we need to up our game. I think I would agree with a lot of what's been said around the labelling. It's going to be interesting transitioning out of the public sector into private sector, which happens for me at the end of this month. And I've absolutely no idea what to expect out there. What I'm sure of is that I'll find good people in the private sector, the same people I've worked with and engaged with in my position as public. And so really from my side, Ashraf, just a word of thanks to SAPI for inviting me in to the space, and a privileged position as always to be able to talk about. These are things that I take, we take very seriously, very passionate about, and just we can only keep building the conversation, having the conversation. That alone is worth the time and the effort, which we need to keep going. So thank you. Thanks for facilitating, Ashraf.
Look, if on the 1st of April we see you driving a Porsche, we'll have some questions to ask. But colleagues, if I may just in conclusion abuse my position as the facilitator and just say just 2 or 3 things. One, we are in a period of uncertainty globally. Whether we follow the World Economic Forum and some of those global international organizations, it's very clear that the way in which globalization, hyperglobalization has happened and has created the inequalities in the world. I think Dion said that at some point in time, South Africa is going to become like Brazil, where it's going to be non-racial inequality. And I think there's a recognition that that is no longer sustainable and that businesses need to look at reduced tax, maybe paying higher taxes and paying higher wages and being more involved in society. And I think that's a kind of thing that's probably going to swing a kind of pendulum that's worth looking at. But in that context, we are in what Gramsci called the interregnum, a period of uncertainty in which old things are dying, new things are being born, and things are happening and that kind of stuff. And in that context, I think we should ask ourselves, how far have we really come? Have we come very far? Have we not gone any far? And as we move out of this interregnum into some kind of certainty in terms of where we'd like to go, that will impact on the legislation, the laws, the regulations we have. And in that context, I really think that SAPI has done a good thing. It's part of muddling through, I suppose, but by organizing the session, you have created the opportunity for various people to raise some very, very pertinent questions on the role of the state, the role of legislation in the state, the role of the state in the economy, and how it makes those contributions and things like that, and how we as planners fit into this whole scenario. This is obviously a never-ending conversation, but as we move out of this interregnum, as the World Economic Forum convinces its large international members to pay better salaries and reduce income inequality, I think different opportunities come to the fore. And for us as the opportunity, and I think as planners who have looked backwards for the past 30 years, maybe looking forward as part of that is where the opportunities will come. And when we muddle through, that's the direction we muddle through on. So thank you very much. You've raised some really, I've got many, many pages of notes here, and I really appreciate the enlightening conversations that we've had. I certainly feel a lot more empowered, and I hope that all of you do too. Thank you to SAPI Western Cape for giving me this honor and privilege to facilitate the session, and I hand back over to Nathaniel. Nathaniel, over to you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much, Ashraf, and thank you very much to all the attendees. This was really a great informative session. And yeah, I just want to touch on what Ashraf has been saying. As planners, if we were given the opportunity to come back when we pass away one day and come back to this country, we're not sure who we will be in the next society, whether we will be black, white, colored, male, female, rich or poor. Any choice that we as planners make today could harm us or benefit us when we come back in the next society. So I just want to state that nobody wants to be part of that disadvantaged group of people. So when we plan, let us plan for the disadvantage and trying to achieve equality. And we will all live in a much better Republic of South Africa. So on that note, I just want to thank Ashraf once again for chairing the session. Also want to thank Peter, Cathy, and Dion for their great insights and willingness to attend the session as well. Thank you also to everybody who contributed to the session. And once again, thank you to SAPI Western Cape for hosting the session. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much.